The final tally, carved into a piece of driftwood hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the slave quarters, was 33. That was the precise accounting of human lives she had snatched back from the precipice of eternity before the world decided her mercy was a capital offense punishable by fire. To truly comprehend the enigma of the woman known to history only as Sarah, and the void she left in the coastal records of South Carolina, one must first immerse oneself in the pestilential and profitable world that necessitated her existence in the year 1731. The settlement that would eventually mature into Georgetown was less a civilized town and more a fever dream carved out of a primordial cypress swamp sitting precariously where the Sampit, Black, PD, and Waccamaw rivers conspired to spill their silt-heavy waters into Winya Bay. It was a landscape of terrible beauty and relentless geometry where the Carolina gold, rice, had already begun to violently terraform the coast, taming the wild marshes into a rigid grid of dikes, trunks, and canals, engineered by men whose names were systematically erased from the ledgers that recorded the profits. The Fairmont Plantation occupied nearly 800 acres of this prime tidal land, a testament to the ambition of Jonathan Fairmont, a 29-year-old second son of a Virginia dynasty who believed the chaotic natural world could be ordered if one simply applied enough pressure. His main house was a fortress against the climate, built of cypress and tabby, a concrete-like slurry of lime, sand, and crushed oyster shells that bleached bone-white in the punishing sun, designed with deep, wide piazzas to trap the faintest river breeze, a luxury unknown to the 63 enslaved laborers who lived in the rows of stifling cabins behind the great house, breathing air thick with mosquitoes and the metallic scent of stagnation. Into this rigid, heat-soaked hierarchy walked Sarah, arriving in the early spring of 1731 as part of a lot purchased to replace labor lost to the winter fevers, her bill of sale clinically brief, listing her as one Negro woman, Sarah, age approximates 25, condition healthy, skills domestic, while omitting the unquantifiable power she carried in the leather pouch resting against her sternum. She was physically striking, tall and unbowed, with a posture that suggested a lineage far deeper than the auction block in Virginia from which she had been sold. But it was her eyes that truly unsettled the overseers and the master alike. They were eyes that did not look down in submission, but rather looked through the surface of things, possessing a quality of stillness and observational intensity that felt dangerous in a person who was legally classified as property. She spoke little during those first weeks, moving through the laundry and scullery like a ghost in the machine of the plantation, silent and efficient as she learned the rhythms of this new hell, the temper of the master, the cruelty of the Scottish overseer Duncan MacLeish, and the hidden web of solidarity that connected the enslaved community. She absorbed the botanical landscape of the Low Country with the hunger of a scholar, her hands constantly testing the texture of a leaf or the moisture of the soil, recognizing that while the geography was different from Virginia, the language of the earth remained the same for those who knew how to listen. It was not merely that she knew which plants could kill and which could cure. It was that she understood the fundamental architecture of suffering, and she possessed an inability to stand idly by when she had the means to alleviate it, a compulsion that would eventually strip her of her anonymity and place her on a collision course with the rigid religious and scientific dogmas of the colonial South. Her anonymity ended with a jagged oyster shell and a field hand named Thomas, a man whose body was a topographical map of scar tissue from years of brutal labor, who sliced his palm open from the base of the thumb to the wrist while repairing a massive wooden sluice gate that controlled the tidal flow. In the humid, bacteria-rich air of the marsh, where the water was a soup of decay, infection was not merely a possibility, but a certainty. Within 2 days, Thomas's hand had swollen to the size of a grapefruit, hot to the touch with black streaks radiating up his forearm, signaling the onset of blood poisoning that would stop his heart within the week. Duncan MacLeish, the overseer who ruled the fields with a lash and a shout, looked at the festering wound, grimaced, and noted in his log that Thomas was a loss to the ledger, refusing to call a doctor for a field hand who was already aging and easily replaced. That evening, as the sun dipped below the cypress line and the mosquitoes rose in humming clouds, Sarah went to Thomas's cabin without asking for permission, disappearing into the tree line with a sure-footed confidence that frightened the others, only to return an hour later carrying a bundle of weeds that she crushed between 2 river stones to create a vibrant green poultice. She packed the wound with the paste and bound it tight with strips of boiled cloth, her voice low and melodic, but threaded with steel as she commanded him to keep it dry, and within 3 days the angry red streaks halted their march toward his heart. A week later, the swelling vanished, and Thomas was back at the sluice gates gripping a pry bar with a hand that showed only a thin pink scar, sparking a whisper network that moved through the quarters faster than the wind, carrying the dangerous secret that a healer walked among them. The whisper network eventually breached the walls of the main house in July when the hierarchy itself fell ill, starting with Duncan McLeish, who was brought low by severe gastrointestinal agonies caused by tainted pork and brackish water, leaving him curled in a fetal position in his cottage, convinced his bowels were twisting into knots. When the local physician was unavailable, it was Betty, a house slave with the ear of the mistress, who tentatively suggested that Sarah might be of use, a suggestion that Jonathan Fairmont accepted out of desperation to get his overseer back to work. Sarah entered McLeish's quarters with the same dispassionate professionalism she showed the field hands, ignoring the racial slurs he muttered through gritted teeth as she examined his eyes and abdomen, then brewed a tea from the bark of the slippery elm and wild ginger, forcing the Scotsman to drink the bitter draught 3 times a day until the colour returned to his face, and he was standing again within 48 hours. Jonathan Fairmont, a man who valued utility above all else, made a note in his journal about her surprising competency with herbals, viewing her as a useful asset for livestock and staff, unaware that he had just opened the door to a power struggle that would threaten his worldview. But the true test, the event that would elevate Sarah from a useful asset to a local legend, came in September when Catherine Fairmont's weak constitution spiraled into a crisis that began as a dry cough and evolved into a wet, bloody hacking that wasted her away before Jonathan's eyes, turning her collarbones into sharp ridges beneath her pale skin. Dr. Archibald Hayes, a man of his time educated in the finest universities of Scotland and armed with the absolute certainties of 18th century medicine, arrived with his lancets and theories of humours, proceeding to bleed the fragile woman, purge her stomach, and seal the windows tight to prevent the miasma of the swamp air from entering the room, a regimen that was slowly and painfully suffocating her in a dark, airless box that smelled of sickness and sweat. The confrontation that saved Catherine's life was quiet but seismic, occurring when Jonathan, frantic with the terror of losing his young wife, dismissed the doctor's warnings about superstition and summoned Sarah to the master bedroom, where she stood at the foot of the 4-poster bed and took in the scene of the terrified husband, the dying wife, and the stifling atmosphere. She moved to the bedside without bowing, placing a cool hand on Catherine's fevered forehead and listening to the rattling breath before turning to Jonathan and stating with a voice devoid of malice but heavy with authority that the doctor was killing her and that she needed air immediately. Despite Jonathan's protests about the dangers of the night air, something in Sarah's certainty broke through his panic, and he threw open the sash, allowing the scent of the river and pine forests to displace the stench of the sick room. Sarah banished the purgatives, boiled water in the cleanest vessel the kitchen possessed, and steeped a mixture of mullein, horehound, and wild cherry bark, while rubbing a salve of eucalyptus and camphor into Catherine's chest to break the congestion. Most radically, she forced the fragile woman out of bed, insisting she sit on the piazza every morning and evening wrapped in blankets to breathe the salt-tinged air of the incoming tide. When Dr. Hayes returned a week later expecting to sign a death certificate, he found Catherine sitting upright, a faint flush of colour in her cheeks, sipping tea. It was a recovery that spread through the drawing rooms of Charleston and the taverns of Georgetown like a scandal, transforming the Fairmont slave into a topic of awe and unease. This was the beginning of Sarah's golden age, a time when she was granted privileges and petitioned by neighbours to treat their ailments, accumulating notches on her driftwood tally, 1, 2, 10, 20, 33, becoming indispensable to the very society that enslaved her until the 34th patient, Jonathan's beloved son Benjamin, fell ill and the fragile truce between her gift and their fear finally shattered. The years between Catherine Fairmont's recovery and the tragic spring of 1748 were a strange, suspended season in the history of the plantation, a time when the rigid laws of chattel slavery bent, however slightly, under the weight of one woman's undeniable competence. Sarah became a figure of whispered reverence and uneasy dependency across 3 counties, her reputation traveling along the muddy roads and riverways far faster than she was ever permitted to move herself. She was borrowed by the Calatin family to treat a grandmother's dropsy, and by the merchant Samuel Hartwell, to soothe the migraines that blinded him for days. In each instance, she was transported in the back of a wagon like a piece of valuable equipment, yet upon arrival, she took command of the sick room with a quiet authority that unsettled the masters even as it healed them. She kept her own counsel and her own records, notching a piece of sun-bleached driftwood she kept hidden beneath the floorboards of her cabin, a silent arithmetic of survival that eventually reached the number 33. These were not merely scratches in wood. They were defiant assertions of value in a world that priced her only by her labor potential, counting the infant son of Rebecca Thornton, who had been given up for dead until Sarah bathed him in cool water infused with willow bark, and the enslaved blacksmith who would have lost his leg to gangrene had she not packed the wound with a moldy bread poultice that anticipated the medicine of a future century. The enslaved community watched this rise with a mixture of pride and terrified pragmaticism, understanding better than anyone that in the Low Country, a slave who became too singular, too powerful, or too knowledgeable was standing on a precipice where the ground could crumble at the slightest shift in the master's mood. Sarah walked this razor's edge with a stoic grace, accepting the small gifts of extra cloth or fresh meat without a smile, knowing that her privileges were merely a lease on her own humanity that could be revoked the moment her utility was outweighed by the fear she inspired. The revocation of that lease began in April 1748, with the feverish cries of a 5-year-old boy named Benjamin Fairmont, the only son of Jonathan and Catherine, a child born late to parents who adored him with a desperate, consuming intensity that made him the fragile center of the plantation's universe. When the fever first took him, it seemed innocent enough, a common childhood malady that flushed his cheeks and glazed his eyes, but within 24 hours, the heat radiating from his small body was intense enough to be felt through his linen nightshirt. Sarah was summoned immediately, and she brought with her the calm, methodical presence that had saved the mother years prior. She examined the boy's throat, smelled his breath for the sweet scent of ketoacidosis or the foul odor of putrefaction, and checked the skin for the telltale rash of scarlet fever. It was none of these, but rather a virulent, shifting fever likely born of the swamp mosquitoes. She began her regimen immediately. Cool compresses to lower the temperature, a tea of boneset and catnip to encourage a gentle perspiration, and a strict prohibition against heavy blankets. For 2 days, the boy hovered in a stable condition, his fever high but manageable, his lucid moments increasing, and Catherine Fairmont, who trusted Sarah with a religious fervor born of her own survival, sat by the bedside holding her son's hand, believing the worst was over. But Jonathan Fairmont was a man governed by anxiety and the pressure of his station. To him, the slow, subtle work of herbal healing looked like inaction, and as the boy slept deeply, a healing sleep, Sarah argued, Jonathan saw only a coma, and his panic drove him to send a rider galloping through the night to summon Dr. Archibald Hayes. The arrival of Dr. Hayes the following morning precipitated a collision between two worlds that could no longer coexist within the walls of the Fairmont Manor. Hayes had not forgotten the humiliation of Catherine's recovery, a miracle that had occurred only after his own treatments were discarded, and he entered the sick room with his ego bruised and his professional armor buckled tight. He took one look at the open windows, the cool compresses, and the hedge-witch tea on the bedside table, and his face turned a mottled purple. He declared that the boy was suffering from a plethora of blood, and that the fever was trapped inside him by Sarah's cooling methods, cooking his organs because the heat had no avenue of escape. The confrontation that followed was brutal in its brevity. Sarah, forgetting her place in her desperate need to protect the child, stepped between the doctor and the bed, speaking with an urgency that approached impertinence. "The bleeding will weaken him," she said, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the knowledge of what was coming. "He needs his strength to fight. Please, just give it 2 more days." Dr. Hayes spun on Jonathan, delivering the ultimatum that would seal Benjamin's fate. He demanded to know if Fairmont intended to be the master of his own house, or if he would allow a slave woman's superstitions to dictate the medical care of his heir, effectively accusing Jonathan of weakness in front of his staff. Jonathan, cornered by social expectation and his own terrifying powerlessness, made the choice that defined the tragedy. He ordered Sarah out of the room, banned her from the main house, and nodded to the physician to proceed with the tools of civilized medicine. For the next 3 days, the main house became a torture chamber sanctioned by the Royal College of Physicians. Dr. Hayes bled Benjamin twice on the first day, opening a vein in the boy's small, pale arm and draining 10 ounces of blood into a pewter bowl, a quantity that would have staggered a grown man, let alone a fever-ravaged child. The logic was that the blood contained the bad humors causing the fever, but the reality was that they were draining the very fluid that carried oxygen to his failing organs. Sarah, banished to the quarters, spent those nights sitting on her cabin steps, listening to the distant, high-pitched screaming that eventually faded into a weak whimpering, her hands gripping her knees until her knuckles turned white. She knew, with the biological certainty of a predator sensing death, exactly what was happening inside the boy's body. The hypovolemic shock, the racing heart trying to pump a diminishing volume of blood, the shutting down of the kidneys. On the third day, Hayes interpreted the boy's pallor as the fever breaking and administered a violent purgative of mercury and chalk to cleanse the bowels, which only served to dehydrate a body that was already a husk. Benjamin died on the 5th day, shortly before dawn, his heart simply stopping from the strain. The silence that fell over the plantation was heavier than the humid air. It was a suffocating blanket of grief that instantly curdled into rage. Jonathan Fairmont locked himself in his study with a bottle of brandy, while Catherine's wails echoed across the rice fields, a sound so raw that the field hands stopped their work and looked toward the house with dread, knowing that such pain required a payment and that the currency would likely be black flesh. The accusation did not happen immediately. It festered and grew in the dark, nurtured by Dr. Hayes, who needed to deflect the blame for a second high-profile failure at the Fairmont estate. At the funeral, attended by half of Georgetown society, Hayes whispered into the ears of the grieving elite, suggesting that it was unnatural how Benjamin had seemed to recover under Sarah's care, only to die so rapidly once proper medicine was applied. He planted the insidious idea that Sarah's remedies were not cures at all, but a form of sorcery that created a dependency, a diabolical binding that, once broken, shattered the patient's constitution. This theory offered Jonathan Fairmont a seductive escape from his own guilt. If Sarah was a witch who had poisoned his son with dark magic, then Jonathan was not the father who had ordered the doctor to bleed his child to death, but rather a victim of spiritual warfare. The whispers spread through the parlors of Georgetown like a contagion. How did she know things doctors didn't? Why did her patients always survive unless she wanted them to die? Was it not suspicious that a heathen woman held power over life and death? By early May, the narrative had solidified. Sarah was not a healer. She was a witch who had infiltrated the Fairmont home to corrupt and destroy. On May 3, 1748, Jonathan Fairmont signed the warrant. The arrest was theater designed to restore the shattered power dynamic of the plantation. They came at dawn, led by Duncan McLeish, who took a grim, vengeful pleasure in shackling the woman who had once cured him, his gratitude long since evaporated in the face of racial solidarity and fear. They found Sarah awake, grinding herbs in her mortar, expecting them. They tore the leather pouch from her neck, spilling its contents, dried sage, quartz, a snake vertebrae, onto the dirt floor as evidence of her conjuring. But the true damnation was found under her mattress, a small hand-bound book filled with sketches of plants and notes written in a pidgin of English and something else. "She can write," McLeish breathed, the shock genuine. In South Carolina, a literate slave was considered as dangerous as a loaded cannon. It was proof of a mind that had transcended its station, a mind capable of organization, memory, and perhaps rebellion. The book was seized not as a medical journal, but as a grimoire, a book of shadows. They dragged her from the cabin in chains, parading her past the silent, watching rows of the other enslaved workers who dared not intervene, their eyes wide with the realization that the gift of healing was no protection against the machinery of the law. As they loaded her into the wagon for the journey to the brick jail in Georgetown, Sarah did not weep or beg. She looked at the main house one last time, her expression unreadable, marking the end of the time of mercy and the beginning of the time of judgment. The Georgetown District Jail was a red brick testament to the colony's desperate attempt to impose order on a wilderness that resisted it, a squat, windowless box situated behind the courthouse that smelled of damp mortar, unwashed bodies, and the distinct metallic tang of despair. Sarah was confined to the northernmost cell, a space measuring 6 feet by 8, secured by a heavy iron door that had been shipped from England at great expense to reassure the local gentry that their property and their prisoners were secure. For 26 days she sat in the semi-darkness listening to the drip of condensation and the scratching of rats in the walls, while outside, the legal machinery of her destruction ground forward with a terrifying bureaucratic efficiency. The trial, convened in late May, was less a judicial proceeding and more a public exorcism designed to cleanse the community's conscience of the death of Benjamin Fairmont. The courtroom was packed to the rafters, the air thick with the smell of tobacco smoke and unbathed bodies, as witness after witness took the stand to transmute Sarah's acts of mercy into evidence of malevolence. Dr. Archibald Hayes, restored to his pompous glory, testified that Sarah's remedies violated the natural laws of physique and were therefore proof of a diabolical compact, arguing that her ability to cure what educated men could not was an inversion of the divine order. Rebecca Thornton, whose own son Sarah had saved, wept as she testified that she had always felt a cold chill in Sarah's presence, rewriting her own memory to align with the prevailing hysteria. Sarah was not permitted to speak in her own defense. Legally, she was an object, not a person, and she stood in the dock, shackled and silent, watching the proceedings with the detached calm of someone who had long ago accepted that the world was broken. The verdict was a foregone conclusion, delivered by a magistrate who had already ordered the firewood, guilty of practicing witchcraft and causing death by supernatural means. The sentence was death by burning, to be carried out at dawn on the 1st of June, a spectacle intended to purify the county of her influence. The keeper of the jail was a man named Hosea Jenkins, a 43-year-old widower with a face etched by mediocrity and a soul that yearned only for a quiet life. Jenkins was not a cruel man by nature, but he was a functionary of a cruel system, a man who followed orders because the alternative required an imagination he did not possess. He brought Sarah her meals, corn mush in the morning, rice and beans in the evening, with eyes averted, terrified of the witch who sat so still in the shadows. But Sarah, even in the shadow of the stake, remained a creature of observation, and she watched Jenkins with the same intensity she had once turned upon the leaves of the forest. She saw the dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. She smelled the faint, bitter aroma of feverfew clinging to his coat. She noticed the way he rubbed his temples when he thought he was unobserved. On the evening of May 29th, 2 days before her scheduled execution, she broke her silence. When Jenkins slid the tin plate of food through the slot, Sarah spoke, her voice raspy from disuse, but clear. "The feverfew will not help her," she said. Jenkins froze, his hand halfway to the door handle. He had told no one of his daughter Martha's condition, the blinding headaches that left the 11-year-old screaming in a darkened room for days at a time. It was his private shame and his private terror, a helplessness that ate at him. "How do you know?" he whispered, turning to face the darkness of the cell. "I know the smell," Sarah replied, stepping into the sliver of light cast by his lantern, "and I know the look of a father who cannot help his child. You are using the leaves, but for that kind of pain, the pressure behind the eyes, you need the flowers, mixed with willow bark, and she must sleep sitting up, not lying down." The exchange that followed was the pivot upon which history turned. Jenkins, trembling, listened as the condemned woman gave him specific, clinical instructions on how to treat his daughter, her voice devoid of malice or manipulation. She did not ask for freedom. She did not bargain for her life. She simply offered the cure because she could not bear to let a child suffer, even the child of her jailer. Jenkins went home that night, his mind reeling with the theological impossibility of the situation. How could a servant of the devil be moved by such selfless charity? He prepared the tea exactly as Sarah had instructed, grinding the willow bark and mixing it with the feverfew flowers he gathered by moonlight. When Martha's headache began the next morning, he administered the draught and propped her up on pillows. Within an hour, the screaming stopped. By the afternoon, she was sitting in the garden, smiling for the first time in weeks. Jenkins sat in his kitchen, watching his daughter play, and felt the foundations of his world crack. He realized with a terrifying clarity that Dr. Hayes was a fraud, the magistrate was a murderer, and the woman in the cell was not a witch, but a savant who was being killed for the crime of competence. The law demanded she burn. His conscience, awakened by the laughter of his healed child, demanded something else. But Jenkins was a small man in a large system, and he knew he could not save her alone. It was then that he remembered the visits of Phyllis Rutherford, the free black baker who had brought charity bread to the jail, and the whispered conversations he had studiously ignored. He realized that Sarah was not just a prisoner. She was the center of a silent web, and all he had to do was open the door. The night of May 31st was moonless, the air thick with the humidity of the approaching summer. At midnight, the town of Georgetown was asleep, save for the watchman who patrolled the docks, far from the jail. Hosea Jenkins sat at his desk, pretending to review the supply ledgers, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He had sent the other guard home early, claiming a stomach ailment. At 12:15 a.m. he stood up, took the heavy iron keyring from his belt, and walked down the short corridor to the northern cell. He did not say a word. He simply unlocked the door, the mechanism clicking loudly in the silence, and swung it open. Sarah was waiting, standing fully dressed in her rough prison garb. She did not thank him. The debt had been paid in the currency of his daughter's health. He handed her a small bundle he had prepared, a knife, a flint, and a loaf of bread, and stepped aside. "The back door is unlocked," he whispered, staring at the floor. "Phyllis left a horse tied at the edge of the cypress grove near the old tannery." Sarah paused for a moment, her hand brushing his sleeve, a touch that bridged the chasm between jailer and prisoner, white and black, living and condemned. "Go," he said, his voice breaking. Sarah moved past him, silent as smoke, and vanished into the heavy, humid night. Jenkins returned to his desk, sat down, and waited for the dawn that would bring his ruin and her salvation, knowing that when he raised the alarm in the morning, he would be playing the role of the incompetent fool to perfection, a small price to pay for the lifting of the weight upon his soul. The cell was empty, the bird had flown, and the legend of the witch who vanished was born not from magic but from the simple, devastating power of a father's gratitude. Dawn broke on the 1st of June, 1748, with a violent streak of crimson across the eastern horizon, a celestial herald for an execution that would never take place. The crowd had gathered early in the courthouse square, a mixture of morbid curiosity and pious judgment, waiting to see the Fairmont witch consumed by the flames that Dr. Hayes had promised would purify the county. When Hosea Jenkins emerged from the jail, his face a mask of theatrical terror, shouting that the prisoner was gone, the reaction was not the outrage of a mob denied justice, but the hushed, superstitious dread of a people whose worst fears had been realized. The cell was scrutinized by the magistrate Jonathan Fairmont and the red-faced physician, but the physical evidence refused to cooperate with their narrative. The lock was undamaged, the window bars were solid, and the walls were intact. In the absence of a tunnel or a broken door, the only explanation that the Georgetown elite could stomach was the one. Dr. Hayes eagerly provided sorcery. She had transubstantiated into smoke. She had summoned a demon to carry her through the iron. She had used the dark arts to cloud the mind of the jailer. It was a comfortable lie, for it saved them from the humiliating truth that a black woman, aided by a poor white jailer and a free black baker, had outwitted the entire legal apparatus of the Low Country. A manhunt was launched immediately, led by Duncan McLeish, who drove his men and dogs into the northern swamps until the hounds lost the scent in the brackish water of the PD River, baffled by a trail that simply evaporated. Sarah had not just escaped. She had been erased from the geography of slavery, leaving behind a vacuum that the white community filled with legends of ghosts and hags, while the enslaved community quietly celebrated the miracle of her disappearance, turning her name into a shibboleth of hope whispered in the quarters at night. In the wake of her vanishing, the Fairmont Plantation began a slow, inexorable slide into ruin, a decline that the locals attributed to a parting curse, but which was, in reality, the result of a profound shift in the labor dynamic. The curse was not supernatural. It was the withdrawal of the enslaved community's goodwill, a campaign of passive resistance so subtle it was impossible to punish. The rice trunks were opened at the wrong tide, flooding the fields with salt water that poisoned the soil for seasons. Tools broke with maddening frequency. Horses went lame. The harvest yields plummeted. Jonathan Fairmont, consumed by the belief that he was the victim of spiritual warfare, retreated into a bottle of Madeira, seeing the ghost of his son in every shadow and the mockery of his slaves in every silence. Catherine Fairmont, haunted by dreams where Benjamin lived because she had defied the doctor, eventually wasted away, dying in 1754 not from a cough, but from the crushing weight of regret. Dr. Archibald Hayes fared no better. He published a pamphlet titled A True Relation of the Escape of the Witch Sarah, intending to cement his reputation as an expert on the occult. But the timing was disastrous. The Enlightenment was reaching the colonies, and the pamphlet was mocked by the scientific societies of Charleston and Philadelphia as the ravings of a superstitious fool, destroying his medical practice more effectively than any lawsuit. He died penniless in 1763, railing against the arrogance of reason, unaware that his own incompetence had been the catalyst for the very legend he tried to suppress. The plantation was eventually sold off in parcels, the great house falling into disrepair until only the chimney stacks remained, standing like tombstones over an empire built on sand. Far from the decaying manor, deep in the blue-misted ridges of the backcountry where the king's writ faded into the sovereignty of the Cherokee nation, a woman named Rachel was born from the ashes of Sarah. She had traveled north along the secret arteries of the Underground Railroad's earliest iteration, guided by the mental map Phyllis Rutherford had provided, until she reached the trading paths of the Cherokee. There, she did not hide, she integrated. The Cherokee healers, pragmatic and observant, recognized a fellow practitioner of the high arts, and a cultural exchange began that would save countless lives over the next decade. Rachel traded her knowledge of African roots and low-country fevers for the Cherokee understanding of mountain barks and spirit mending, becoming a bridge between two medical traditions. She married William Crawford, a mixed-race trader who asked no questions about her past, and together they built a cabin in a valley that appeared on no colonial map. For 16 years, she operated as the unacknowledged physician of the frontier, treating white settlers, Cherokee elders, and escaped bondsmen with equal care, keeping a meticulous journal in her pidgin script that documented her treatments, a testament to a mind that refused to stop learning. She died in 1764, succumbing to pneumonia after walking through a blizzard to deliver a settler's breech baby, a final act of defiance against death that mirrored her entire life. She was buried beneath an ancient oak, her grave marked only by a river stone, but her legacy was carried in the blood of the hundreds she had healed, a living monument far more durable than marble. The truth of Sarah's escape remained buried for nearly 3 centuries, hidden in the sealed archives of conscience and the marginality of history, until it was pieced together by the historian Margaret Hensley in 1926. Hensley's dissertation, initially dismissed by the academic establishment, drew upon the deathbed confession of Hosea Jenkins, recorded in the private journal of Reverend Samuel Blackwell in 1779. Jenkins, dying of yellow fever, had finally unburdened his soul, admitting to the pastor that he had opened the door not out of bedevilment, but out of gratitude for his daughter's life. "We burned her because she made us feel small," Jenkins had whispered, a damning epitaph for the era. Hensley also tracked down the estate inventory of a Charleston medical student, William Drayton, who had purchased a leather pouch of curiosities from a bankrupt estate in Georgetown, the very pouch taken from Sarah, and noted in his diary that the contents were of superior efficacy to any in the standard pharmacopoeia. These fragments, combined with the oral histories of the Cherokee descendants who remembered the black healer Rachel, formed a picture of a woman who had transcended the cage of her century. Today, near the overgrown foundations of the Georgetown Jail, there is no statue of Sarah, but in the medical records of the time, in the survival of families who should have died, and in the story of the jailer who chose mercy over law, her presence endures. She remains a phantom of the archives, a reminder that the most dangerous power a person can possess in an unjust world is simply the competence to save it and the courage to walk out of the cell when the door is finally cracked open.